There's Brooks. No, but he's going to come. Come up here. Today we're going to be discussing pre-K funding and its history. We're going to start with John Brown. John, I'd like for you, when you go up, to introduce yourself. I can't even remember all the titles you've held. And then Marcia Moore is going to speak, and then we'll take questions primarily from the committee members. And if Ellen Williams, if there are any questions for you, we'll direct those that way. John, if you'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Okay. I'm John Brown with the House Budget Office. Prior to coming to the House Budget Office one session ago, I was with OPB for a long, long time. In fact, I was at OPB back when this program started. And part of what I want to do today is explain to you a little bit about what was going on back in 1988, 1990, 1993. Some of the discussion as to how this program was formed, how it was developed, how it's funded. And in telling the story, I'm going to end up telling you a little bit about the lottery, because you can't really tell the pre-K story without also talking about the lottery story and, to some extent, the hope story. But along the way, if you have any questions or anything, please stop and ask me. I'd like to explain all this to you and make sure that you understand where we are in terms of pre-K. I do not have an overhead. Instead, I've passed out a PowerPoint to you. We have a few extra copies. Not enough for everybody here, but if anybody wants a copy of this presentation, then I can get it for you. Okay, on the first page, we're going to talk about the pre-kindergarten program, and we are going to talk a little bit about the lottery overview. I'm going to save the lottery for the end, because decisions that you make about the pre-kindergarten program, you can't make decisions on those without knowing where you stand on the lottery as a whole. If you'll turn to page 3 in this handout. The pre-kindergarten program was a key component of Governor Miller's lottery proposal. Not sure if any one of you were here in 1988, but you may recall, or those that remember, Governor Miller actually proposed a lottery before 1990. When he was lieutenant governor in 1988, he introduced legislation through his floor leader to create a lottery for educational purposes. At that point, it didn't have the definition to it that the lottery we have today did. It didn't talk about scholarships or pre-kindergarten and so forth. It was just strictly a lottery for educational purposes modeled on Florida. In 1988, that proposal didn't go anywhere, but he used it as something to run on in 1990. Well, he was elected governor. That was the center or focus of his campaign, is that he wanted to bring a lottery to the state of Georgia for education purposes. But in order to bring the lottery to Georgia, he had to wait till 1992 when he could put it on the ballot, because we had to have a constitutional amendment to create a lottery. Well, between 1990 and 92, he did all his prep work to try to get the constitutional amendment out there for voters in November of 92, and we as staff members did a whole lot of work trying to focus what would the programs look like that would be paid for by lottery. And just to rehash a little bit, the lottery, when it first started, was going to be about 1/3 pre-K, 1/3 hope, and then it was always designed that there was going to be money for equipment and technology, capital outlay. Now, that wasn't just a wasteful spending of money. It was envisioned, but the governor also knew that over time that 1/3 was going to get scaled back, and we'd be where we are today with hope and pre-K being the lottery. Again, we did a number of things with that other 1/3, from constructing school buildings to buying K-12 computers. Those were all good things, but over time pre-K grew and hope grew to the point that we couldn't do those. And that's part of what you'll be considering as part of the Hope Chest bill. The other thing, go ahead.
Where did the technical schools get in the Hope grant? Was it part of the original?
I'll tell you a little bit about the HOPE program, if you'll let me come back to it at the very end, because I want to talk a little bit about HOPE and its impact on the whole lottery and what it means for pre-K. Going back to 1990, though, the governor knew that he was going to push for the 92 referendum and the constitutional amendment. We started doing work as what would HOPE look like, what would pre-K look like, and the governor didn't want to wait on pre-K until 1992. He wanted to go ahead and start the pre-kindergarten program using state funds and piloting the program. So in the fiscal year 92 budget, which would have been acted on in the 1991 session, the governor put in $2.9 million to do a pre-K pilot using state funds. This pilot served, as I recall, roughly 1,000 students. It was income-driven, sort of your at-risk. And when I talk about at-risk, and Marcia can correct me if I'm not speaking or telling the story right, but I associate at-risk with largely the same as Title I type kids. Those poverty, those are usually our at-risk ones. In 1992, we put in $2.9 million for the pilot program. That was continued in fiscal 93, and the primary focus of this pilot program was to get some data and see how the program would work in the hopes that we would have the lottery. And of course, the goal of pre-kindergarten all along has been to make sure that kids are ready to start school, ready to learn. If you turn to page 4, that brings us up to 1992, November of 92. The constitutional amendment permitting a lottery was on the ballot. It passed, as I recall, by about a 60%, 40% vote. And it authorized a lottery for educational purposes. But even though that constitutional amendment passed, there was still work to be done in the 1993 session because we had to set up a lottery commission. We had to pass budgets that created the Hope Scholarship Program and the pre-kindergarten program. We had to pass enabling legislation that defined what the lottery could be used for. So all that work was done in the 1993 session. A couple of points that I would make to you is that when the lottery bill passed, it was always the intent that the lottery would supplement and not supplant education spending. That was a big key point because Florida had used a lottery to use lottery dollars to replace some state dollars. I'm pleased to say that we have a good track record here. The money from the lottery has always been used to add on or supplement and not supplant. A couple of other points I'd like to make is that the pre-kindergarten program, other than it being an authorized use of lottery dollars, has never been in statute. It's not in the code anywhere. And for a number of years, the Hope Scholarship Program was not in the code. It was only in 1998, as Governor Miller was exiting or leaving office, that the Hope Scholarship Program was written into the code. So you've got two programs, one's codified, one's not. The lottery funding, the first budget that you'll find lottery funding is fiscal 94. As I recall, the first lottery tickets were scratch-offs, and they went on sale in June of 1993. And in the session of 1993, we had made our past budgets that envisioned the lottery being up and running and budgeted some money. The very first lottery budget was $139 million. And that $139 million, $37 million of it was for pre-kindergarten, $40 million of it was for the Hope Scholarship Program, which in the beginning was only a freshman-sophomore scholarship. And then the other $60 million was used on technology purchases, largely for K-12 and the university system. One other point that I would make about the lottery that was very interesting when Governor Miller was campaigning, trying to get support for passing the constitutional amendment, he said that one day maybe the lottery would bring in $175 million for education. That was the envisioned maximum at that time. and today the lottery appropriation is $841 million. In fact, we hit $175 million in the first year. So it's just interesting to see how what we thought was going to be is so much different than where we are today. On page 5, some pre-K guidelines. Governor Miller was very hands-on in creating these programs, both Hope and pre-K, and deciding how the lottery was going to be apportioned. What we did as staff for him back then is we would listen to him and we would hear kind of what he wanted in general. We would go try to work on some details. Every so often we'd report back to him. He would look at what we had done and he would make some corrections and send us back to do some more work until he got it the way he wanted. But he was very hands-on, especially in what he wanted done with pre-K. Of course, from the very beginning, pre-K was going to be lottery funded. The $2.9 million that had been put in state funds and was in the fiscal 92 and fiscal 93 budget, that was going to come out once the lottery was in place. He knew from the beginning that pre-K had to be a public-private partnership type arrangement. We flat out did not have enough classroom space in the metro area. We already had trailers, so where were we going to put pre-K kids? So he knew that the metro area was going to have to be served by private providers. He realized that in some of the rural areas we did have some extra classroom space that we could do pre-K. He also wanted to avoid competing with private business. If there were already preschool programs being offered, we didn't want to try to put those out of business by putting them into the public schools. One of Governor Miller's, something he was adamant about, was that there would be no capital outlay, no construction. If public schools had classroom space, we could offer pre-K through the public schools. But if they did not, we were not going to build buildings for that. We would then resort to private providers picking up the slack on that. Some other guidelines from 1992 to 1994, the pre-kindergarten program served at-risk kids. Again, very comparable to the Title I that you're probably all familiar with. These were kids that potentially would be behind if they showed up for kindergarten. We needed to give them some extra services. We need to get them ready to start school. But because the lottery took off so quickly and we started realizing more money, both the pre-kindergarten program and the Hope Scholarship program expanded quickly. Hope Scholarships went from freshmen and sophomore to juniors and seniors, and then some other add-ons along the way. The pre-kindergarten program went from at-risk kids of about 30,000 being served in the first year to almost doubling by fiscal 95, the second year of the program. We were approaching 60,000 kids by year 2, and that's because we opened it up to all who wanted service. The funding formula for pre-kindergarten.
I had one question. Was Governor Miller clear that he wanted it to serve all children subject
Yes.
to availability? He never intended it to be at risk only?
Because we were operating under the idea that we were only going to get 150 to 175 million, we started both lottery programs very slowly, the freshman, sophomore on the Hope side and the at-risk only on the pre-K side. But once the revenue started coming in so quickly, he knew he wanted to expand it and offer it to all who were interested.
So his priority was at-risk children, and then as there were more funds, he added in it.
That'd be accurate.
He saw that we would add in other kids. All right, thank you.
Just for enrollments are somewhere around 75,000 right now.
For fiscal 2008, we're looking at 78,000 and some change.
How much? What's the dollar figure on that? Just so I know.
The proposed budget is 325-ish, 330, about 330 million.
Oh, okay.
What was the initial means testing when it was set initially to serve at-risk kids? What was it adjusted relative to poverty line, similar to each care?
I can't exactly answer your question, but my recollection was that there was some income limitation on it, that the kids coming from a certain family, they had to be at or below a certain income level.
They would be receiving 10 subsidized childcare system, food stamps, free and reduced lunch to children who are truly low income that receive some kind of federal help.
Just so I'm do you have a sense of what that income level would be relative to?
I don't right off the top of my head now, but I'll be happy to share that with you.
Okay. As of, or since fiscal 94, the pre-kindergarten program has been funded on a formula basis. And I want to get into some depth about that formula with you, what's included, and the fact that it is now 13 years old. Is in need of some work probably. If you look on page 6, there's a graph that depicts the enrollment increase for pre-kindergarten since 2001, fiscal 2001. Generally, the pre-kindergarten program grows about 2,000 kids a year. Some years it's maybe 1,500, some it's 2,500, but it's right around the 2,000 slot level. That would represent about 3 to 4% per year on average. As you see on the chart for fiscal 07, the amended budget contemplates having 76,500 students. That number goes to 78,000 in fiscal 08. If you look on page 7, there's a chart table there that gives you the year by year since the beginning of funding for pre-kindergarten. You'll note that in fiscal 92 and 93, the $2.9 million of state funds, beginning in 1994, the lottery kicked in, $37 million in the first year. And then the proposed budgets for fiscal 07 amended in 08 are $309 million and $324 million, respectively. Through the years, if this 07 and 08 budget are approved, there has been $3.3 billion budgeted for pre-kindergarten. And Marcia probably could give you a better total number of children served.
So that's 790,000 children in all.
On page 8, let me start laying the groundwork for the formula. Just as I mentioned that Governor Miller would work with us as staff and kind of tell us generally what he wanted, and then we would try to put some details with it and then discuss it with him in a back and forth type arrangement, the formula development for pre-kindergarten was no different. We put some things on paper and have him react to it, and he'd give us some guidance, and after several exchanges we got what we have today. But what I want to point out to you is that the formula that we use for pre-kindergarten, there was never a study committee for it. It was the governor and just some staff people back and forth, and we crafted something that would be an enrollment-driven type formula. And I don't think any of us would have expected that it was going to last 12 to 14 years relatively unchanged. It was just a way to drive some money. And keep in mind that when we were working on it, we were talking about a formula to drive $30 million. Today it's a formula that's driving over $300 million. The formula, as I mentioned, continues today relatively unchanged, other than just a slight change in the different types of models that are available that I'll talk about, and some cost of living differences between areas of the state, some changes there. The formula that you're going to see today is pretty much the same one that was put into effect back in 1994. And that formula was modeled based on kindergarten as it existed back in 1994. And what I want to point out about kindergarten in 1994 that's different than kindergarten today is in 1994, kindergarten was based on a class size of 20. In 1996, Governor Miller later brought kindergarten down from 20 to 18 in a classroom. And then Governor Barnes's reform effort in 2000 brought it from 18 to 15. So if you looked at kindergarten today, you'd see some differences between pre-K and kindergarten, between kindergarten in 94 and today. But back in 1994, we were looking for something to draw from as a basis for figuring out how to fund pre-kindergarten, and kindergarten was the model that we drew from. On page 9, what is in the pre-kindergarten formula? As I said, it's based on a class size of 20, which was in effect in QBE back in '94 for kindergarten. The formula provides funding for a lead classroom teacher, the salary plus the benefits. It provides money for an assistant teacher. Back in '94 we had paraprofessionals, so we drew from that and we said that we would pay for some assistant paraprofessional type teacher in a pre-K setting. It pays for a certain level of operating expenses, and that level of operating expenses was also drawn from what were we paying out on a per student basis for materials and supplies for kindergartners back in 1994. Then the formula goes on beyond that. These three items, the classroom teacher, the parapro, the fringe benefits, and the operating expenses, those are the direct classroom type expenses. There are some other add-on type expenses that some children receive, some do not. Resource coordination is one of the add-ons. If you have an at-risk child that needs some additional services of some sort, we budget money for that. If you have a child who, once again, is probably at risk that needs some daycare after the pre-kindergarten day ends, we provide for extended day. Some of the kids need transportation. Now, we don't have a bus system running like the public schools do, but some children need pickup and drop off. There's a transportation amount budgeted. We also budget for any new classes starting up. If a new provider comes online, there's an allotment of $8,000 per class to buy some of the tables, chairs, fixtures, other items that would be used. And then there's an item called training and experience, which I'll talk about a little bit. It's a little bit of a sore spot between publics and privates, I believe, where if you are a teacher in a public setting offering pre-kindergarten, we pay based on the state teacher salary schedule, and we also acknowledge any training and experience. If you're beyond an entry-level teacher at some year of degree of training and some year of experience, we're going to pay the actual amount of your salary. We do that in the public setting, but we don't do it in the private setting. And it creates a salary differential. Some feel that privates are then destined to lose their teachers to the publics once a spot opens up. Have a question?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I may be cheating ahead here, but I see what it says down at the bottom, does not provide funding for capital outlay and construction.
Right.
Was this model based around the service being provided in a private setting, where in terms of the operating expenses, amount of salary? Because if I'm just trying to think through the operating expenses of the private care provider. I mean, embedded in the cost of running a facility is the cost to keep the lights on, to pay the rent if it's rented lease space. So and within that, there's capital outlay. It may be paid on a lease basis, but that's in essence capital outlay that's embedded in those operating costs. Was that anticipated in these numbers?
The model was built on QBE, Quality Basic Education Formula, kindergarten, but within the operating expense amount within kindergarten was what was called maintenance and operations. We didn't pay to build the building, but we were contemplating paying an amount of money to keep the walls painted and the lights on and those things. So there is a dollar amount that I'll go over with you for doing that.
So for private care providers, they're taking the money that it takes through a model to maintain just daily facility maintenance of a public school building.
Right.
They're using that in essence to fund the lease and the capital outlay, monthly capital outlay equivalent of running the private facility.
Right.
Am I understanding that?
That's the model. Now, I won't comment on whether in all cases the amount of money we give is adequate. I'll withhold that. But we did create a model where we basically said to the private, if you'll provide your space to us, we'll pay for all that goes on in it. We'll pay for the teacher and all the supplies and materials for the children, and we'll give you some money toward maintaining that building.
Through a separate formula or just through this?
Through this.
I had a question. For example, in a school system somewhere in Georgia that does not have SPLOST, and we have a number of them that don't use SPLOST, particularly if they're not growing. How do, in the public schools, how do they pay for the capital costs?
They do not.
So they would be on par with the private providers in that respect.
The capital outlay formula that's in law for K-12 does not permit the counting of children or the space needs for pre-kindergarten. So if a public school decides to offer pre-K, yes, there probably are some spillover benefits, because if there's a classroom or two, you probably do not meter out the lights for that. You probably just pay it for K-12 as a whole. But there's no money for pre-K coming through capital outlay or SPLOST or any of that kind of stuff for K-12.
Can they use SPLOST funds, the 1 cent sales tax, in school systems that have that? Could they use that, or do they?
This is just an assumption on my part. If a school system wanted to use some of its local dollars to provide for a pre-K classroom, they could probably do that. It's a local decision.
But the state doesn't.
But how many actually do that, I don't know, and the state does not.
Okay.
Question on this sheet here. Is this one of yours, or that's one of yours?
I'm getting there, though.
You're getting to this one. Is that the one that shows the?
Let him do it.
Okay.
We'll say whatever.
All right. I'll let you get to this.
Okay. And as you pointed out, my last point on page 9 is that the formula never included the capital outlay, and that was in keeping with what Governor Miller wanted at the time. On page 10, the pre-K formula, getting a little deeper now into it so you understand how it works. The pre-K formula envisions original formula envisioned 4 types of service delivery models. One is that you would have a class that's being taught by a certified teacher. It's got all the credentials, professional standards, certification, so forth. The second model is that you would have a class that has a teacher with a 4-year degree. Slightly smaller salary, but a 4-year degree. The third model is that you could have someone with a 2-year degree teaching the children. Salary, again, slightly less than the 4-year. And then the fourth model that existed but has been discontinued as of fiscal 01 was where you have a child development associate teaching the class. That's someone who doesn't necessarily have any type of degree but has some sort of a credential, and they've got some training in child care and preschool. That model was discontinued, and Marcia could probably comment better as to why that was discontinued.
Our research has shown us that outcomes for children were better when they were taught by teachers who at least minimally a 2-year degree. So there's a wide range of that.
Okay, so we have these 4 models, and then also a feature of the formula is that we were going to do cost differences between public, private, and certain zones. And let me introduce for you, within the QBE formula that exists, at various times we've kind of toyed with the idea that there should be some recognition of cost of living differences around the state. Maybe metro areas are higher than rural areas. And it really never went anywhere for funding K-12. But as part of this formula, we thought, all right, we're going to have a public-private mix. The cost for a private provider in metro Atlanta is probably higher than it is somewhere else, so we're going to recognize some cost differences. When this formula was first developed, we had 4 possibilities. We had Zone 1, which was all the private providers in metro Atlanta. We had Zone 2, which was all other metro areas, Columbus, Savannah, Macon. Then we had Zone 3, which was pretty much the rest of Georgia. And then there was the public column. What we found over time is that Zones 2 and 3 were not that much different, so they were collapsed into a zone. And now we have 3 possibilities. You can be Zone 1 private, Metro Atlanta. You can have Zone 2, which is everywhere else, and then you can have the publics. And the data behind that cost of living difference at the time was based on some of the Department of Labor data, cost of living indexes, and trying to adjust that. The Other considerations that go into the cost differences between a public and private setting is what we just talked about. We recognize that while not official, some local school systems will supplement the pre-K program. The lights are on in that classroom space, and you're not going to bill them separately. So when we were putting this formula together, we recognized that the public rate should probably be the lowest rate, not without regard to salary now, just on the operating side, that it should be the lowest rate because there will be some spillover benefits, and then that the privates should get some amount greater than that. Okay. On page, what's labeled A, it's a table. This is a breakout for the fiscal 07 amended. This is the enrollment by category. What I'd like to point out to you is if you look at the bottom of the Zone 1 column, 35% of the children enrolled in pre-kindergarten are in the metro Atlanta area in a private setting. 22% roughly are in other private settings. So combined, 57% of the 76,500 children that we envision serving are in a private setting. 43% are in a public school system somewhere. And what I would also point out is to the right, 60% of the children in pre-kindergarten are being served by in a classroom setting with a certified teacher. So that's the enrollment.
Question. Geographically, are most of your public schools with pre-Ks located in the southern part of the state?
I wouldn't say no. I wouldn't say that's necessarily true.
I would classify it as they're in non-metro areas.
Yeah, okay, non-metro.
Yeah.
Non-growing, rapidly growing communities.
Yeah. Right. So this is your enrollment. If you'll turn to page B, see if I can bring this all together for you. This is a comparison of where we were in 1994 with regard to kindergarten. I mentioned we borrowed heavily from kindergarten in 94. At the time, we were paying $582.44 in operating expenses per FTE for kindergarten. We took that $582 and said, okay, we need to do something toward building a pre-K model. And we devised this original pre-K operating amount that you see here. You'll note that the pre-K amount is approximately 20% higher than where we were at kindergarten. And the reason for that is that the kindergarten rate was going to have a certain amount of 5 mil share and some local resources that would get added to it. We went ahead and said, okay, we're going to throw a little bit extra in on the pre-K side because they don't officially get any local tax money or 5 mil share, but we'll go ahead and put some extra money in. And as we were breaking this out, we threw it into an equipment category. We said, okay, we'll put some money out there, whether it be for equipment or, they were not held. There's no expenditure control on this. They can spend the money however they wish, but we thought, all right, we'll throw it in the name of equipment. And so we devised this $686.16 amount as the original pre-K operating expense amount. That's independent of salary. So when multiplied by the 20 students that would make up a class, a public pre-K class would get $13,723 for that class. Now this amount has only been adjusted one time, and that was in fiscal 2003. There was a 2% adjustment to this amount. And if you look over in the box, you'll note that under the public rate amount, it is now $13,997.66 that we would pay for a class in a public setting. That is exactly 2% greater than the original amount of $13,723.
And that's not capital costs, and it's not salaries, but it's everything else.
That's right.
Okay.
It would pay for paper, materials, supplies, the lights, and really, as I said, there's no expenditure control. It's really whatever you can squeeze out of it.
And you're still basing this on 20 children per classroom?
Yes.
The average is not that.
Yes.
The average hasn't changed for pre-K.
No, but the pre-K stayed the same when you let kindergarten come down.
I just wanted to ask, we're going to start using the microphones. We have so many people here, not everybody can hear. So if you'll press your button. Thank you. We'll take care of you. All right. Thank you.
Now, with the $13,997 that's budgeted for the public rate, if you see how we got from 1994 to that number, the Zone 2 and 3 amount is 21.5% greater than the public rate. And again, that goes back to 1994. We pulled some kind of data that suggested that there was a differential in offering private pre-K services versus public. And then there's a 67% differential between Metro Atlanta area and the public rate. So we adjusted those amounts up. So the publics get a greater amount for operating expenses. I'm sorry, the privates get a greater amount for operating expenses than the publics do. So we'll make that point clear, and then we'll talk about the salaries a little bit. Are there any questions on that before I finish putting this together for you? If you turn to page C, each year when we do the budget for pre-K, we come up with what are the rates going to be for the coming year, and Early Care and Learning publishes this rate sheet to the public and private providers. As I mentioned, we have 3 models now. We originally had 4, but we're now down to where either it's going to be a 2-year model, a 4-year model, or a certified teacher. And then there are varying rates by zones 1, 2, and 3, and then the public. Depending on which setting and whether it's public or private, the various rates are itemized out here. And under each of these models, you'll see that we budget a certain amount for the lead teacher. We budget an amount for the teacher assistant parapro. There are fringe benefit amounts budgeted, and then there's the non-salary amount. And you'll note that the non-salary operating expense amount are the amounts that were from the prior sheet that we just talked about. Now, let me point out a few differences to you. You'll note that the lead teacher for a 2-year setting versus a 4-year setting versus a certified teacher, the salary rates differ. Of course, the 2-year is the lowest. The certified teacher of $31,000, that is the beginning entry-level salary for a teacher on the state salary schedule. That's assuming they have a T4, 0 years of experience. The teacher assistant salary of $12,638, that is the same for all 3 models, private, public. That amount was the amount for parapros back in 1994, and it has been adjusted upward by the amount of whatever salary increase was appropriated each year. I don't recall right off what the parapro salary was in '94, but it was probably in the $8,000 or $9,000 range, and between the 6 and the 4s and the 3% pay raises each year, it's now to $12,006. The fringe benefits, you'll note that they are at 22% in most places, but there's a notation made under certified teacher that if you are a certified teacher, your fringe benefit rate is 27.4%. At one point, all fringe benefits were 22%. That was the going rate for public teachers and what we budgeted here. But over time, because of health insurance changes with the state health benefit plan, retirement changes, the public rate has changed, and we've matched that, but we did not match it for the other models or the non-public teachers. Part of the reason or the thinking behind that is that the privates are not under any obligation to actually offer or pay these benefits. I think there's a requirement that 90% of salary money gets paid out in salary, but there's probably varying levels of fringe benefit packages per provider. We know what we have to pay publics, but the other is kind of all over the board. If I could draw your attention to the bottom of this page, a comparison. I mentioned to you the parapro salary budgeted within pre-K is $12,006. At one point, we eliminated parapros from QBE, and then Governor Barnes's reform effort brought them back. When he brought them back, it was at a slightly higher level. If you compare the parapro salary in the QBE formula today, the payout is $13,400 per parapro versus the $12,600 that's in the pre-K formula. A couple of other comparisons. If you were to look at what do we budget on a per FTE basis in the QBE formula for kindergarten, the answer is $4,222. But keep in mind that that's per FTE on a 15-to-1 basis. If you do the conversion and say, okay, what would we be paying for kindergarten if it was still on a 20-to-1 basis? The number is $3,542, which is very comparable to the per student amount that you see under certified teacher in a public setting. Those are very close. One other point that I want to make, coming back to the training and experience issue, where we actually pay the salary for teachers based on the salary schedule. One thing that's misleading about this rate sheet is that if you look under the public column, certified teacher, you see that we pay $3,522.56 per child for public certified, if they're in that model. What's missing here is that there's also an add-on amount for training and experience. And on average, that's about $750. So the per child amount would be about $4,200, $4,269 actually shown here. That's the amount that we pay on average per child in a public setting with a certified teacher. And that's the point that I was making, where privates feel like there's a higher salary in a public setting, and so they are destined to lose some of their teachers to the public side whenever an opening becomes available.
Yeah, I had another piece there, if I may. In the counties, there's county supplements, too, that increase that salary. So this would not necessarily really show the salary of what that would really be in the public setting. It's definitely higher than that in almost every county.
Sorry, to her question, just to clarify, I'm not sure I understood you. So you're saying in a private setting, there's no county supplement, but if a public pre-K program were happening within a school next door to the kindergarten class, those teachers would be supplemented?
Yes.
If you turn to the next page, page D.
Some don't even pay the Social Security.
This is a breakout of the money. For fiscal 07, we envision a budget, governor's recommended $309 million for pre-kindergarten. If you just do the multiplication of taking the rate sheet on the prior page and multiplying by the number of students, it generates $258 million in just basic grants, the amount that it takes to operate the classroom. Of the 258, $130 million is being used to pay lead teachers in whatever model and whatever setting we're talking about. $59 million is being budgeted for the assistant teachers and parapros. And when I say the teacher expense, that includes their salary plus their fringes. And then we're budgeting $68.8 million to pay operating expenses, anything from the supplies and materials to the lights, utilities, upkeep, equipment, so forth for the building. Then, beyond the $258 million that I mentioned here, I talked about earlier some of the add-ons, the additional amounts that are budgeted for various services that are largely needed by those at-risk children. Well, first off, look, training and experience. $18 million is the amount that it takes for us to actually compensate teachers where they are on the salary schedule. The resource coordination, that's where children need some extra social services, or I can't even begin to tell you all that's in there.
Right, we have research that shows us that children in programs who actually have a resource coordinator in them that look after and work with the families of our at-risk or poorest children, that those children are tremendously more apt to get medical attention, to get the services they need to identify learning barriers. So that extra resource coordinator really helps our at-risk program, when we have the research to be able to show that the benefits and the referrals that these children get to meet their needs is highly increased if you have a resource coordinator in the program.
Transportation, again, some limited offering of pickup and drop-off, $2.2 million. Extended day, $2.5. These are some of the children who need some additional services or daycare after the pre-K day ends.
The transportation and the extended day, now what, does any of that apply to public schools for the buses, regular bus pickup for the pre-K or the after-school or before-school programs?
It's actually, no, I don't think it goes to the public schools at all. It goes to the subsidized child care and the facilities, the centers. If the child is a certain income, then we actually provide money to the Department of Human Resources, a certain amount, so those children in the pre-K program will be sure to get a slot, a place for their child to stay for an extended day.
Does public schools pick up any of these children on the regular bus routes, or do they keep them in the after-school, before-school programs?
I would think some of them do. I don't know that for sure, but some of them are public schools. We do have public school child care, after-school programs.
But, so therefore, the public schools they're not getting any of the after-school dollars for these programs, you don't think?
I don't think they are.
I got some heads nodding one way and some another.
I'm not sure. I don't know. It depends on who runs that program. Some public schools are ran by private entities too.
So the private providers say the public school systems do get it, but we're not sure.
The after-school program can be in the public school system. Yes, sir, it can be. And it may be ran by the public school. It may be ran by a private entity through a contract. I don't think, I need to find out. I'm not sure if the public school system can get subsidized child care for those extended day dollars.
Because I know the parents have to stay, if they've got a child in the after-school program, they have to pay the after-school fees. So that's my question, if these, are any of these students staying in the, I don't know.
That's a good question. We'll need to find out from the Department of Human Resources. We can do that. I'll ask that question.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question about the,
Yeah.
could you just fill me in a little bit on the extended day hours? I don't have a good feel for what that looks like, just from a morning and afternoon thing.
Our pre-K program is 6.5 hours.
Okay.
For some parents, they need to deliver their children, let's say the child care facility, I'll give you an example. They need to deliver the child at the child care center, let's say at 6:30, 7 o'clock. Pre-K may not start till 8 or 8:30. So they need help for that child to stay there in the program that morning. And then the program goes on to, let's say, 2 to 2:30. For the afternoon, that child may need to have a place to go because the parent is not at home to pick up the child and take them home. So the child has to be in some kind of child care setting, sometimes it's a child care setting, in order to participate in pre-K.
So we're talking about as early as, say, 6 a.m. in the morning until 5:30, 6:30 p.m.?
6:30 in the afternoon, it could be a very long day. Yeah.
Now, are there any federal dollars, like TANF dollars, something to help support that, or?
There is. There is. What we've done, though, a lot more money goes through that. What we just do is we just give a 2.5%. That does not cover every child in our program that receives subsidized child care. That's to support and help the Department of Human Resources to ensure that our children who need pre-K services are not placed last on a waiting list. It actually really moves them up at the top of the waiting list because a lot of children in our state, as we all know, they need subsidized child care. So the ideal is through this contract that we have is to ensure our children get moved up to the top. Because if they're not moved up to the top of the waiting list, they may not get the pre-K services at all.
I can ask a question offline on that. I don't want to take the committee's time, but I still have some questions on that.
Okay. And then I mentioned earlier about an $8,000 amount for startup to pay for some equipment whenever there's a new class or a new provider coming online. And then you'll see about $1.5 million of miscellaneous costs where there are some collaborative efforts between this program and Head Start. Whenever this program started, we didn't want to just nudge Head Start completely out of the state, so we try to keep some efforts going between the two programs.
If I could add to that, if I may. Head Start programs are 4 hours a day. Our pre-K program is 6.5 hours a day. So by blending some of our funds together, we were able to stretch both of our dollars a little bit more, where I think noticed last year we were able to serve like 4,000 additional children just by paying a 2.5 hours rather than 6.5 with this partnership with Head Start. So it was a benefit to the state. It's also a benefit to this lower at-risk population because Head Start serves our most low at-risk, financially at-risk population. So it's been a real positive partnership.
And then the cost of actually operating a central office for early care and learning is $7.6 million. That includes visiting all these centers and processing the payments and a variety of activities. It represents less than 2.5%, which I don't think is bad at all. On page...
Oh, one more question. Yes.
My question has to do with the Head Start. What are the qualifications for the teachers in Head Start? I mean, if you're going...
Yes, sir. If they provide, if we blend our programs together and they're providing pre-K services too, they have to meet our guidelines as well as their own.
Thank you.
No compromise.
Thank you.
On page 11, some pre-K issues that you're going to be dealing with. I've tried to stick to the facts as I went through. I'll probably interject a little opinion here now. This funding formula, as I indicated, was thrown together in a few days. I don't think anybody envisioned it would last 12 years unchanged. It's in need of some revision, or at least taking a look at it to see if the way that we currently fund is the way we want to continue to fund. In my mind, we're sort of getting into that area now where it's public versus private, and I don't think you want to go that route and have an argument. Maybe you need to look at the formula and see if there needs to be a single rate as a potential option, but certainly looking at it after all this time. Also within the public-private, there's the issue of training and experience and salaries, and is there competition going on? Do we pay so much more in the public setting that the privates are going to lose their teachers to the publics whenever there's an opening? The pre-K operating expenses. Now you'll be talking about the potential for an increase in operating expenses. There has only been 1-2% adjustment in fiscal 2003. And you'll see on my presentation that I made a notation there, and it's that QBE formulas only had 1 in 24 years. We seem to have a knack for neglecting formulas. And it's not a notation that I put there to suggest that you shouldn't do a pre-K formula or operating increase. It's just that I wanted you to keep some perspective that this formula has been treated about the same as some of our others. And then there's the issue of equipment replacement that we've talked about some through the years. The $8,000 that's provided for a startup cost. You've got some providers that have been with us from the very beginning 10 years ago or more, and maybe an equipment refresh would be in order.
One question. Do public and private get the $8,000 when they start? Okay, thank you.
And then the last point under pre-K issues is keeping in mind that we are now down to lottery funding 2 programs, Hope versus pre-K. And I don't want to bill it as a competition, but there is kind of a struggle for dollars since we have a limited fund source. And I want to now go into just quickly updating you on the lottery. I said that I really couldn't talk about pre-K without at least talking about the lottery and some extent Hope. I just want to make you aware of some things that are going on in the bigger picture that is lottery. So if you turn to page 13, recap a little lottery history. Just like this program began in '94 and was funded with lottery. The lottery began its initial funding in 1994. I mentioned to you earlier that there was about $140 million total. You may or may not be aware the state gets about 30 cents of every $1 lottery ticket sold. When the lottery legislation was passed back in 1993 session, the legislation suggested that as near as possible the state would get 35 cents of every dollar. But from what I understand, running a lottery is a difficult thing. There are trade-offs. The lottery could perhaps return 35 cents to us, but at the expense of marketing and advertising. So 35% of some lower amount if you don't do your work, advertising, keeping fresh games, and so forth. So our 30 cents or 30% of whatever's being collected now is probably greater than 35% of what would probably be reduced collections. I'm no lottery expert, but that's what we've heard, is that we have a mature lottery that's been in place for 12 to 14 years now, and squeezing out additional revenue is rather difficult.
Question. This 30% yields $841 million.
Mm-hmm.
That means it's something in the order of $2.8
billion
worth
of lottery ticket sales per year. That's right. And of course, I'm sure you know that the bigger the jackpots and things like that, the better we do. It's a good thing when we see triple-digit jackpots. That means sales are brisk and it's returning more money to education.
While we're talking about lottery funding, has a study been done as to the breakdown of that $2.8 billion? Who's spending that $2.8 billion? Is that a question that's outside the scope of this? Okay.
You can get a breakdown from the lottery corporation and how much your county and your district is spending. And how much they're receiving back in the amounts of prize money. You can get all that from the Lottery Association. I think it's called Association.
Also, a few years ago, the Carl Vinson Institute did a research on who was actually buying the tickets.
Right.
That would be a few years old.
That's what I was getting at, just in who's writing these.
It's on their website.
Carl Vinson has that.
I also mentioned earlier that the current budget, the proposed budget for fiscal 07 and 08, is $841 million in lottery proceeds to be split between Hope and pre-K. It's not an even split, and I'll cover that in a moment. But our lottery revenue grows between 2 to 4% a year. 4% if we're in a really good year. It probably averages 3%. So what I want you to keep in mind is that in a given year, we're looking at maybe 17 to 34 million new lottery dollars, and there are certainly demands on those lottery dollars. If you turn to page 14, some general background about the lottery. Since
when the presentation was made, that we were told by the governor's budget estimator that the lottery was actually going to decline next year, and then the next day I think I read something which says no, it's going up, and I don't know where that is in terms of
the way I would answer your question is that given that we do have a lottery that's been deemed to be mature, we could have a decline. It's due to have a decline. But so far we've sort of defied the expectations, and we've managed to continue to grow at about a 3% rate each year. Now, a couple of years ago when the Hope Scholarship was under review, and you all passed legislation to put some controls on that and true up the B average and do some various things, those efforts had been successful in helping build a little nicer reserve account, and it has slowed the growth of that program to avoid what might have been a crisis. But as far as the revenue growth, we've still come in at about 3% each year. So.
John, you might not be able to answer this question, but you're talking about the flatten out of the amount of money we're receiving
selling theirs.
their lottery and then having
So,
a more stable amount. Have we looked at anything about selling our lottery?
I don't think so.
I think everybody's sort of looking to see what Texas does.
I had a question. What effect have the other lotteries in the surrounding states had on ours?
I can't answer that question, but the fact that surrounding states were starting up lotteries was part of what had us a little worried a couple of years ago when legislation was proposed about the Hope Scholarship Program.
And I had a question. I know there's at least it appears anecdotally to be an increasing percentage of Georgia students when they attend college or staying in state. I guess because of the differential, it's becoming so expensive to go out of state or to a private college. It would seem that that would strain, if we're growing on average 3%, that would affect it as well.
Somewhere later on in here, but let me just say now, this is me talking. The efforts that were made a couple of years ago to make sure that if we said Hope scholarships were for B students and making sure that it's a B and truing that up and putting some caps on the number of hours, all of those efforts were successful in slowing the growth in the Hope Scholarship Program. And in fact, if you look at the Hope budget, it's been fairly flat. And if you look in the amended budget, you'll see that the pre-K increases are being paid for by taking some money out of the Hope Scholarship Program. We'll probably continue on for another year or so, maybe, like that, with Hope being fairly flat. But at some point, the growth will probably kick back in between enrollment increases, between tuition increases that, even with the guaranteed tuition, there's still some tuition increases. That program will start growing again at some point.
Okay. Thank you.
On page 14, just some figures for you. Since the lottery's inception, and given the numbers that are in the fiscal 07 amended and 08 budget, there's been $9.8 billion from the lottery made available for education expenditures. Pre-K, as I pointed out earlier, has received $3.3 billion, which is about 34% of the total. And then the Hope Scholarship Program has received $4.6 billion, 47% of the total. The other 19%, that was money that at one time was being expended on some classroom construction, K-12 computers. Of course, it's pointed out that we spent money on satellite dishes in the very beginning. That sounds like a comical expenditure now, but back at the time we did that, we didn't have the internet. Satellites was going to be our way of doing distance learning. Overall, in the fiscal 07 amended budget, it's now Hope and pre-K at 300.
John, we get a question here. Yeah.
I'm sorry, and I might have missed it. The capital outlay piece, I didn't catch you speaking to that. Was that, what context was that spent in? Is that mostly K-12? Or?
Most of it was K-12. Back in the mid-'90s, we started a fast growth capital outlay program for systems that had a lot of trailers. That was who it was geared toward. But anyone who had large increases in students. And in the beginning, we were going to do that with cash, lottery cash. That's now been flipped over to bonds. Each year for the last 4 to 5 years, we've done that as part of the bond package.
Okay.
But that was the bulk of the capital outlay.
Okay. One more question. Yes.
I got to ask my question again. Does the Hope money also includes the grants at technical colleges?
Yes.
Is that correct?
It does. When I refer to Hope, I'm really talking about the Hope Scholarship Program, the grant program to the tech schools, the additional tuition equalization type amount to the private schools, and I'm also including some miscellaneous scholarships that are for engineering and teacher promise.
Right.
All of those. Those are all under the Hope heading.
Okay, thank you. I just didn't want everybody to believe that all of this went to students at the university.
Right. Bottom line for fiscal 07, and this would be true of 08, expenditures are roughly 2/3 Hope, 1/3 pre-K. And if you flip to the next page, there's a table there labeled page E. That's just a history for you. I've broken lottery expenditures from the very beginning into 4 broad categories. That's how we used to look at it. There's the pre-K amount, there's the Hope Scholarship, as well as the other scholarships we were just mentioning, capital outlay for largely K-12 purposes, and then there's the technology, which was computers in the classroom, and at one point we would fund some obsolete equipment in DTAE and Regents.
Would you say that based on this information, we're many years into the lottery now, but I imagine we're starting to see the fruits of our labors because your pre-K kids should be smarter as they're coming through college. It means they should be getting B averages. Is that what been said? I think you would see it. Which means we're going to probably see it more on the Hope Scholarship end. Demand's there, I would think.
Right. The next page on page 15, let me tell you that, as I said earlier, the efforts to look at Hope were successful in terms of slowing the growth in that program and also allowing us to build our reserves. The lottery legislation set up 2 specific reserves. One of them was that we were to set aside 10% of lottery revenue for an overall lottery reserve. And in that account right now we have $80 million. The law also specified that we were to set aside 50% of projected or the prior year actual Hope payout in a reserve account, so that if you started running short, you would never leave kids stuck with the college tuition bill. We have $223 million in that account. And then this unrestricted account is everything else above those 2 mandatory reserves. And there's $440 million in that account. So all totaled, there's $744 million in reserves. Now that's good news on the one hand, but what I want to caution you about as you make decisions on spending any lottery dollars is that as part of the Hope legislation a couple of years ago, there was a provision built in that said the first time that this unrestricted account, the $440 million, if it falls by as much as $1, then the Hope books start getting cut. The first time it happens, the books get cut in half. The second time it happens, they go away, and the third time it happens, the Hope mandatory fee payment goes away.
And the Hope book is about 300, isn't it? Is that right?
It's $300 a year.
300, which is about a third if you take 2 semesters of your book expenditures. Thank you.
So while we have some healthy reserves the way the legislation was set up, you still have to be kind of cautious with your expenditures to make sure you are only really spending how much you bring in each year and not dipping into these reserves, or else there'll be some consequences.
Now, that has the force of law like any general appropriations bill does, no more, no less. Is that correct? Okay, so that's...
So once again, let me just say, I'm not advising that you do nothing. I mean, you got to do what you got to do, but just be mindful that decisions that you make about either of these programs can have consequences on the other because they're competing for what's now a fixed, relatively limited fund source.
When it drops down to 1 time, let's see, if we build the reserve back up, does it go back? Okay, so once it's done, it's done.
That's right. And I've talked with Chairman Harbin's got a bill that you all may be taking up later to try to make those triggers a little less sensitive. Instead of it being a $1 drop, what constitutes a real crisis in the lottery? Maybe it's when it drops 5% or 10%. So later on, if you see that bill, you'll know what's going on there. It's just trying to make these triggers less sensitive.
How does this money work for the state? Is this sitting out there earning
Interest.
Of course.
It is.
Has any of this ever been used in any kind of revolving loan capacity where we're...
The next page, and I'll quickly wrap this up, some other things to keep in mind. What I call lottery expense drivers. Within the Hope Scholarship Program, if we have a 1% increase in enrollment across the technical schools or the university system or the private schools, each 1% increase in enrollment is about an additional $7.5 million. If you have a tuition increase of 1%, it's approximately $2.5 million. Within pre-K, we normally add the 2,000 students a year. Each 1,000 slot increase is somewhere in the $4 to $4.5 million range, and it depends upon the mix, whether it's public or private, but it's somewhere within that range for each 1,000 kids added. A salary increase, each time we do a salary increase for teachers or state employees, pre-K teachers get that, and it's paid out of lottery dollars. Each 1% salary increase for all teachers is $1.9 million. And if you do an operating expense increase, and you did it for all public and private, it'd be about $701,000. And remember that some of these would be compounded. Perhaps you have an enrollment increase and a tuition increase. So given that average of $25 million new dollars a year, trying to manage it and do the things you have to do in terms of enrollment while at the same time being mindful of the reserves and the triggers. And then the last thing that the final page I would say to you is that the formula probably does need some study. We had the 2003-2004 study committee for the lottery, but it focused largely on hope at that time. It didn't look too deep into pre-K. The formula could stand someone to look at it, see if it still makes sense, see what the future ought to be, and at some point we'll probably have to look at the lottery again. Hopefully that'll be a few years away, but the day's coming that we'll have to look at that again.
John, we still don't have a true V in terms of high school graduate program.
I would say probably not. But
What does that mean by true V?
In some school systems, an A may be 93 to 100. In other school systems, it may be 90 to 100 is made. So consequently, you have children with a B average getting the hope who make an 80. You have other children who maybe make an 85 and don't get the hope.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I was at 90,
Well, that's what I'm saying. But each county has its own grading scale. So you've got thousands of kids who really aren't B students who are still eligible because they may make an 80, which is a C in most systems, I would hope.
John,
Me to me.
when the state, they look at these students did
Did they look at grade inflation at all, or any way to monitor or control that?
I'll turn to the grade inflation's been one of those topics. Does it exist? Doesn't it exist? I personally think that with hope it does exist, but in terms of trying to get that out of the equation, I don't know how you do that.
I've looked at it, and none of the states really have a model, a good model for how to do that. I mean, I think that, I'm inclined to think that you could, by looking at other test scores, whether it's graduation test scores or SAT, ACT, whatever that state uses. Have you heard of anything being floated? Okay. Did the commission look at tying it to one of those tests? Like in Georgia, obviously the SAT would be.
As I recall, back 2 or 3 years ago, there was some talk about SAT requirement being built in, and it was rejected.
I just didn't know if the
for the
study
biases.
committee looked at it.
They did look at it, and we did not vote for
We
it.
looked at it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the idea still is that
Yeah.
I think most of the education research indicates that SAT is not the single most important determinant of how a child does in college.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is,
Yeah.
the little bit that I've looked at over my last 35 years indicates that you cannot predict the result on that single factor. So the idea there. But I think a B should be a B in every 159 counties.
I'm going to ask, since we're kind of getting limited, we still want to hear Marcia more. I'm going to take a question here, and then we're going to move on and let you finish and see if there are any more questions specifically on pre-K.
I'll try to make it quick.
Yeah.
I see an expenditure projection here for Hope and for pre-K. I don't see a lottery anticipated income. What is the historically, if we track, again, given the context of mature lottery, what is our expected income versus expenditure? I didn't see that in the numbers.
Yeah, it's not in here. Let me tell you how this works. In terms of budgeting lottery dollars, the governor sets a lottery estimate just like he sets the state fund estimate that we all have to work within. We're not at liberty to raise or change that.
Sure.
And in terms of the governor doing his estimate, he relies on the Lottery Commission to report to him how much money they think they can return. From the study a couple of years ago, their expected level of return, our stated level, is about 3%. So that's what they think they'll deliver each year.
No, last year, if we were to, if total expenditures were $841 million, say $840 million, are you saying we only took in $860 million? So there's only a small percentage left over, or is there a significant chunk left? My sense is at this point we're still bringing a substantial amount more each year through the lottery than we're spending. It's just that's not anticipated to last forever. I guess
that's right.
What is the number last year that we actually took in from the lottery? I haven't seen that number here yet.
Yeah, we would have to get that.
To me, that's the million-dollar question. That's what extra money we've got.
Okay, one last. Go ahead, Representative. Yeah, and then we'll just tell he can get on. Yeah.
This is kind of a sensitive issue, I'm sure, for everybody. How many illegal do you think we have in our pre-K program? Do we have any idea? Or you're not allowed to do that, are you?
Don't play that, David.
Go on, John. Do you have any?
That's all.
You're done? I had a couple questions. I was looking at the number of slots, kind of at the beginning of the presentation where you had how many slots we increased each year on page 6. So I'm looking at 06, and we'd had a 2,600 slot increase from 05. And then the amended budget has an additional 1,586. I would add that to the 06 number, right, for how many slots there were in 06, and come up with 4,186, which seems substantially more than the 2,000 average that you mentioned.
That was a unique time. I mean,
This year?
Because other states also saw population growth in that children 4 years before that were born, there was just a big population growth during that period. So we've noticed that in some other states as well, and then we're noticing a little bit of a downslide in some other states. So it's something that we're looking at within our office right now, comparing our states with other states on 4-year action being inside and using this program. So, of course, we have the largest 4-year-old program, but other states do have 4-year-old programs, and they're having population issues that are influencing their program as well. So we're looking at other states for that.
Okay. All right. Yes.
We saw that in Georgia was a 2.65 mid-year midterm adjustment, which would reflect it's not just a 4-year-old, it's all the way up the ladder. So, most of our population increases in migration, not natural childbirth. So I would suggest that, as the chairman indicated, it's higher in the next few years based on projection. I mean, what would fourth fastest growing state or something
Yeah.
like that?
We're one of the fastest growing, particularly in under 18. And I know some of that 2.65 was Katrina, right? And then there was one other that Kathy Cox mentioned. Do you recall, John? She said it was Katrina, and if you took out Katrina, I'm sorry, what?
The other in the K-12 was foster children being counted.
Yeah, remember we passed that bill last year, about 1,000. Well, no, I'm thinking of only residential foster, but we started counting the foster plus that. So I think it still was in the 2%. So this is substantially more than twofold higher, really, than what we're seeing in general public school. I just thought that was a high number. Any other questions for John pertaining to what he has presented?
And what I wanted to do was cover that history and some numbers and the formula and stuff. Marcia's much better suited to answer the questions about actual delivery and where it's being offered and stuff
Okay.
like that.
Thank you, John. You can stay so we can ask a question. Okay, Marcia? Go.
We've already talked.
Well, actually, I feel like there's very little to say. John did such a wonderful job. He really covered our funding formula and a lot about our program. So I'm going to really rush through a few things. Leslie, could you? I think you all have the handout as well. One thing I do want you, as we talk about this program, so then you must keep in mind, and you brought up a really important thing, I think, right then, Representative Jones. If you think about this, pre-K children are very fluid. Our percent growth is pretty unpredictable. It's hard for us to predict. When we look at K through 12, each child, or at least from first grade on, there's required to have a slot for those children. So you can kind of have an idea of what your growth is going to be and kind of watch it. We may have, let's say, we have 65% of our children in Georgia is being served in pre-K. Well, that means we have 35% that we have great potential for growth, not to grow, because it's choice. It's based on choice. So it does influence our numbers quite a bit, I think. So going through just quickly, we're going to talk a little bit about this year, and I'll just fly through some of this. We have 3,890 classes right now with a total of 76,039. That was on our December roster. We were funded about exactly what John was talking about. And this year, including that with our 14 other years that we've served pre-K children, we have 791,050 children have been served in the Georgia pre-K program. In this school year as well, 57% of our children are served in the private sector. And when we talk about private sector, we're talking about private child care centers. We're talking about, Head Start programs. We're talking about, also we'd be talking about military bases, just all the others that would fit into a private. But that's a very small percent. The majority of our programs are clearly in the private child care centers. And in the public, we have 43% of our children are served in that. When you asked about the zones, we wanted to kind of give you a graphic exactly what the zones 1 and 2 look like in Georgia pre-K program. And these are based on the market rate survey that the Department of Human Resources does so they can set their subsidized child care rates. They do this every 2 years. The last one was done in 2005. We'll be having another one this year. If they get it in soon enough, that will also influence how much per child rate is going to be in Georgia, because we serve Zone 1 and Zone 2. Our Zone 1 is considered the urban area. Zone 2 is the smaller urban areas and the suburban areas. As you can see, this year we've got Camden County at the very end has been included in Zone 1 this year.
So I have a question. So when we add a county
Yes.
to Zone 1,
Yes.
all the private providers in that zone get an increase.
That we get an increase, yes, in that county that we've added, yes.
And so when we're talking about what drives the total cost of pre-K,
Yes.
as Georgia becomes increasingly suburbanized,
That's right.
The cost will go up.
Absolutely. As we include more of those high urban areas, yes, we'll have more and more. We'll have more cost to go in on the private side.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yes.
Representative Amos.
Why would Camden?
I've asked the same thing. I don't know. All I know is this is our data from the Department of Human Resources, so I do not know. I don't know. We asked that twice. Just today we mentioned it. So.
Is that where St. Mary's is?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All that new building by the.
Must be. Maybe they work in Jacksonville, Florida or something. That's probably it. Okay, so that's just an interesting piece. John demonstrated a bit of this, exactly what are we paying for children, or how many children are being served in the zones based on the teacher credentials, and we've laid that out as well. And I think it's interesting to note right here that 79% of our children are being served with teachers that either have a 4-year degree or they're certified. So, and as you can tell on our slide as well, the majority of certified teachers are located in the public sector. And, of course, that's a requirement for most public sectors. But, again, it is more attractive to be working in the public sector if you're a certified teacher, more than likely if you're going there for pay. That would be a big influence. Okay, we pay in this school year term. We have 2 ways that we do our payment. John mentioned this. We have instructional rate and our non-instructional rate. In 2007, our instructional rate was based on the teacher credential and based on the teacher's salary for the private and public, which we know is different, and based on class of 20 students. And then our non-instructional rate is based on a class of 20 students as well. The private zone, he's gone over this, 23,000 in Zone 1, 17,000 in Zone 2. For our private, our public is 13,900 for our public in the non-instructional rate.
Again, John mentioned too, this is, as you can see, Georgia's funding for pre-K has been very, very flat. We've been pretty consistent with our increases in our operating amounts to run our programs. And we also have here 2003, there was a 2% increase in operation funds for our private providers in 2003, or in all of ours for non-instruction, excuse me. And then the training and experience, the teacher compensation, let's just pass that because you've already spoken about that. I want to talk about areas that we know affect our funding. What is going to have an impact on how we decide how many children we're going to fund, etc. First of all, if Head Start is enrolling a lot of 4-year-olds, common sense tells us there won't be as many 4-year-olds available to serve into the Port Georgia Pre-K program. So depending on how Head Start's funded in our state can have an impact on how many 4-year-olds we have. Of course, the population growth estimates, and I do want to mention this, that has been a very difficult thing to do, is judge population growth for 4-year-olds in Georgia. We've typically had a contract with Georgia State University. This year we're working with an economist, which we feel like we're going to get much better estimates for next year, and that should be based on county numbers too, which will help us decide more on funding issues and awarding classes. So that we feel very good about. We got to remember, it's important to know that not every parent is going to want their child in pre-K. That's just a given. But we don't know how many of those parents are going to want their child in pre-K. We don't know that for sure. The other piece, too, is providers have a choice whether or not to provide pre-K. Some want it. Some do not want to provide it. They have various reasons why they may not, but that's just a choice. So when you have the provider choice, we end up many times having a capacity choice. Does the county really even have enough classrooms to be able to offer pre-K to every child in that county that may want it? That's a serious issue in our program. Do our counties have capacity in which to serve children, whether it's public or whether it's private? And then the facility history, when we look at funding a pre-K class, when we're working with our private providers, we look at what is their record, their licensing record. Do they have a good licensing record? Do they have severe, serious rule violations that could impact the 4-year-old pre-K class? We also look at nutrition services. We provide those programs within our own department. And this kind of gives us a gauge of whether or not the rules and regulations, the guidelines in our pre-K program be followed. We also look at audits, which we don't have up there. We look at audits to see if they're have they been financially responsible with their monies that we've given them on the state level. And then existing programs, we look every year. Pre-K is based on a contract. If the guidelines are met and the program's being delivered with the standards we expect, then they can assume if there's a need there in the county that they'll have another pre-K class the next year. If the quality's been lacking all year, they very well may not have a pre-K class that next year. And then we also have the potential unserved children, and this is what I know all of you have heard about, is the waiting list. We get calls throughout the years that there's children on a waiting list here. We know that if you'll give us another classroom, we can fill it up with 20 children. We've really struggled with that. And what we've always done in the past until before this year, we've always actually asked for waiting lists. Centers maintain waiting lists. We know that. Public school systems have waiting lists. Sometimes, in fact, we did a little research on this, 47% of the parents put their children on multiple waiting lists. That's what our research has showed us. So you don't really know what waiting list is really true and what is not really true. So it's very difficult. But what we've done in the past have gone into a county and asked to see those waiting lists, to see whether or not there's duplicate children on the waiting list, and to see if there's children that are truly not being served so we can help them find a slot. This year, we've been more aggressive about these waiting lists. This year, we actually asked every pre-K program in the state to submit to our office a waiting list so we could look at their names on the list, also run it through by the names on the roster that were submitted in September, and to see if there's children that are on duplicate waiting lists, see what that number really is once we clean it up, and see how many children can we assume are not being served in Georgia that want to be served. What we found from doing this exercise is that it is not as easy as it sounds. And we found some things that we had to do a whole lot better. And we learned, yes, ma'am.
I do have a question. Excuse me. In the context of not having enough classroom space for the demand for the program, has your department considered, in essence, we're in a rationing situation where there's only so many slots and there's more people. Has your department considered means testing that waiting list, looking at Do we have parents of significant means who are participating in the program, and parents of humble means who are waiting on the waiting list?
There's two things that we really know that we would clearly look at. Number one is there a more creative way to create new classrooms, such as subcontract classrooms? That's always a possibility. The other is that we would want to look at the low-performing schools. And that's what we would look at, is look at low-performing schools, see how children are doing in those areas. And if we have children in schools that are not, where the kids are not performing well, then we may very well want to concentrate more in funding classes within that area and creating opportunities for those children. That's really what we've looked at more than anything, because we're really about getting children ready for school. We need to be paying attention to that.
I hear you. I just...
What I would like to do, if we could, it's all right, is let her get through this, and then we'll probably have a few minutes to talk about some alternatives and changes we might want to look at, or if she's looked at. Thank you.
Okay, that'll be fine. With the waiting list, again, we discovered that parents, we can't collect Social Security numbers. That's against the law. So parents call their children many different things. So on the waiting list, we have various names of children, first, last, middle names, a lot of different ways they report their children. So we find we didn't really have a good way of collecting that information. So we've developed a more consistent format for collecting data on children's names, their families, their parents, information on them for this year. Whenever we do the rosters for September, when we ask for the first roster, we'll also then ask the waiting list be submitted at the exact same time with the rosters. We believe that will help us be able to get a cleaner waiting list and really identify the children that need to have a slot that did not have one. What we want to do with this information is we of course have some classrooms that may not have all the children filled in that classroom. We want to make sure from those waiting lists that we fill those vacant slots in classrooms. So we're using those slots that are already sitting there that may not be filled for whatever reason. We also want to be able to use the waiting list to identify pockets of children that are not being served. Are there truly children, because of population transition, that they're really children that are just not being served? And it'll help us make funding estimations, our populations, be able to see where the shift in the state really is with the growth. And we're going to do something different this year as well. On our web, we're going to be putting having a way to highlight facilities or providers' names and their programs and highlight it whether or not they have vacant slots in that classroom within their program. So we hope to direct parents to go on the internet, look at our information on the web, and see where vacant slots really are in their community. Help them make some choices. What we did a very informal, exploratory in-house study this past in January. When we received those waiting lists, we were able to get parents' names and telephone numbers. We pulled a sample. We had about 350 parents and families on the sample. We had 139 actually responded with us and talked with us. We were able to locate. We had consultants within our own department call these parents that were on the waiting list and ask them some important questions. And there's a lot to it. These things, I think, are very, very critical. We asked the parents, how do you pick your pre-K class? What makes you pick it? How do you make your choice? Their number one most important factor was location. Where was the program located? The second one was sibling. Did they have a brother or sister of that child go into that program? Whether it be daycare or a school program. They like their children to be in the same program at the same time together. We found that of those that we called, 40% of those parents had already found a slot for their child somewhere. So they're pretty creative. 40% had found a vacancy in a pre-K slot somewhere of those ones that we had called. 23% of those 135 parents were keeping their child at home. And 28% had placed their child in a tuition-based program. And then we had about 9% either had them in Head Start or had them in some other place. So we were glad to see that, because what we saw was parents were very creative on the whole. And they were finding places to place their children. Many of them were, for the ones we called.
I'd like to leave a few minutes here to talk about some of the issues that we've all been looking at. I had a couple questions. What is your best estimate, conservative estimate, for how many are on a waiting list that are on that waiting list because
they could not find a slot?
They could not find a spot.
that is a extremely difficult. I mean, I want to answer it, but I mean, I would think, we thought maybe between 4,000 to 6,000, but it's hard to really truly say because we couldn't really clean the rosters up, and then we couldn't clean up the names well enough. I think September, when we clean up those rosters in September, October, November for next year, we're going to have a good answer for you, a very good answer. This year, the answer is just not. It's just not good.
Well, and I think I want to clarify this, that however many could not find a slot, is my assumption correct that it's not because Georgia wasn't willing to fund it?
That's right.
Because
we've been funded
we
for every
fund basically
absolutely,
whoever shows up. There's no
absolutely.
cap.
Yes,
when we
ma'am.
estimate, when we fund, we budget for 3,000 slots next year, if 4,000 show up, unless we change how we're doing business down here, we'll fund 4,000.
If we can find a place to put them, if there's a capacity in that county, yes, ma'am. We've never not been able to do that. We've been fortunate. Yes.
And then one last question. I know Cobb just has decided to not offer it in their public schools anymore, just as Gwinnett doesn't, and frankly, aren't many.
There's
more
other
Fulton.
counties, Paulding, Douglas. Yes.
What do you think that could result in a decline? I mean, how many children are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about 500 and something children that we're estimating, and before I think it was 2001, all of Cobb County's children were in the private sector then. So, we're working with Cobb County to make sure those children have a slot. They've been great. But the reality is the private providers very well should be able to pick up most of those slots. They have at one time before.
Okay. Other questions from the members or discussion on issues related to pre-K?
I was just exploring the idea of a means test as a way of rationing out service. From the very beginning, there was the expectation that it be for disadvantaged kids, not for all kids.
Yes.
I wouldn't want to anecdotally see moms dropping kids off in sport utility vehicles so they can go play tennis. To the exclusion of kids without means being able to get access to the program.
I'll tell you something interesting about that. We found in looking at our data that we were serving 55% of our children are truly at-risk, lower-income children. And what research tells us that it's amazing that when you have a program that's for all children, non-means tested, the children of the lowest income find a way in that program. And in fact, many times they actually prefer that program. And the reason why they do, a lot of it is because of confidence reasons. It's not another at-risk for poor children only, and it builds self-esteem by not being a part of that. We also see that our children, of no matter what their income is, but particularly our middle-income children and our working poor families, many working poor families may be left out, but we find our middle income children, the gains for both of those class of children is tremendous. It really is. We have talked about in the department, if we can, and we're going to work on this, in really looking at broad brackets of income. We'd like to look at that next year and see, how many children in our program are being served that parents make $150,000 to $200,000. How many are being served? Look at the brackets. So if someday we have to start doing a means tested, we'll have something to base that on. And I would hope that when we do that, for the sake of our program, I hope that will be something we'll look at with Hope as well, because I think it works well for both the benefits that they receive and what can do. So I hope that will be something that committees will take up and discuss both sides.
Thank you, Representative.
Yes, ma'am. I don't know if you can answer this or not, but I was going back to this sheet that I had on page 14 here. You showed pre-K since, I guess,
This is John's sheet.
John's sheet, yeah. 3.3 billion, 34% of the total Hope, and then or the total lottery, and then 4.6 Hope. And you'd mentioned the total number of students served through pre-K. I was wondering if I could get the number of students that have been served during this period of time. Did y'all have those figures?
The whole period. It was 791,000. It's in your handout. That the little.
Okay. What about for the Hope?
A million. Yeah, that's right. They just celebrated their million. That's right.
So we've served $1 million for the Hope and 700.
About 800,000.
Yeah, close to that.
Second one. Second sheet, after the cover. First sheet. No, look.
Okay, 709,000. Okay.
I had a question, Marcia. It's the B sheet for John's sheet. A number of us have heard that one of the pressures is on the operations cost.
Yes.
That there's been 2% increase, and I guess what, the 12 years or so that the lottery's been funding it.
For the lottery.
And what these numbers show that's not just private providers; it's public. What we don't know is are some of the public schools getting I don't mean a teacher, that's a separate issue, but are they being further subsidized? I would think that's all across the board. I mean, we have counties, school systems in Georgia where they can't buy new textbooks for their K through 12. My cousin works in a county where her school system doesn't even pay her portion of Social Security, their portion of Social Security. So there's a real range that it would be difficult to just assume that all the public schools are further subsidizing the operations.
Right.
But and although I see that private providers do get a considerably higher amount for operations, I guess under the assumption, John, that the public schools, there's some economies that you get by having in a public school. What are your thoughts on raising, giving an increase in operations? Because my little simple calculations say that if we gave a 2.5% increase for operations across the board to public and private providers, that would eat into about 1,000 slots.
I mean, would serve. And it's a very, very tough question. It's a tough question, I think, because we don't have really clear data to tell us the cost of pre-K, the true cost of pre-K. And I know that we've looked at it. We've worked, and with OPB, we've looked at the Consumer Price Index. We've looked at a lot of different things to try to determine, what would be the potential right ways for this. What should we do? But this is truly a policy decision. It's a policy decision whether or not you're going to serve additional children, or it's a policy decision whether or not you're going to increase the operations. And that's something I think that's really up to the governor with our recommendations and working with OPB. I mean, it's a policy decision. It is.
Well, and anecdotally, I think you could look at some of the public school systems and private providers. Some private providers, I'm sure quite many, choose not to offer it because it's not cost effective, although which would be a very difficult decision because being in a daycare center, they realize that's sort of an extra carrot to have the whole family come there.
It puts them in a place where they almost have to have it.
It's not, but it's non-economic. We also know it's not economic for many public schools, i.e. look at Cobb. Gwinnett doesn't even offer it because it's not economic for them to build the extra classroom space with local dollars since the state doesn't provide it. But I realize it's a policy decision, and when I look at the numbers, and I suspect Katrina is driving that number a little bit since we saw it. Don't you think? I mean, since it. Well, what I shouldn't say.
We
don't
actually
what do you
had
think,
200 and something children we picked up in pre-K that year. Yeah.
So it didn't. Well, it's
it
not
didn't
very
have a
much
tremendous
then.
impact on pre-K. It really didn't.
That's like a half.
But it might have years out.
0.5%. But
we were shocked.
We did fund. Or not fund. Well, I say fund, and there were over 4,100, almost 4,200 slots last year. I guess what we don't know is that a spike? To me, the greater policy question is: do we serve the one? If we in fact believe that the operational amount is insufficient, do we fund the students we fund, more adequately, whether it's adequate or not, or do we try to skim by and fund more? Right?
And that is absolutely the policy decision. I mean, it's truly the policy decision. And it's difficult because you don't have any really clear data at times to be able to make those kind of decisions. So it's a difficult place. Common sense tells you yes to both of them. Research tells you yes, serve the 1,000, but common sense tells you, the reality is it costs to provide this program. But what are the other costs that different programs have coming in, and what other income do different programs have coming in? So, and I know that's what the challenge is. We don't always know, as you said, what public school systems, what resources they have that may be beyond the private. It's just a tough question.
You and I have talked about this. I mean, the lines are going to cross even more as we move forward, and we will have, I think, have to look at. We are rationing pre-K now. The fact that there are let's just guess or estimate 4,000 students that aren't served.
Right. For whatever reason.
It's been rationed because if it was economic to serve those 4,000, at the very least, private providers would come in and pick up every one.
I think there's multiple reasons, but I'm
and,
sure that would be one of them.
I mean,
Yes, yes, I think
you know, I
so.
put it out there, but I think it's a hard one, and what also I look at, we did put certain controls on Hope. We already have some, but we added. We have yet to do that, and I would like this committee to consider, along with Brooks Coleman's committee over this next session, should we look at putting together a study committee of the caliber, scope, and scale that we did with Hope a few years ago, realizing that we can't just isolate it. I think that was a flaw in the previous one, and that we primarily would look at pre-K, but we need to put Hope there too, because it's the same pot of money. More money goes to one, less goes to the other. And but I would like to get some other thoughts from the committee. If you have any other questions, yes.
Question, some of us on the whole commission sought to do that because, just before then, you were talking about K through 16, pre-K through 16, and we recognize you can't fix one without the other. But there are others, and I also fought for the grade, single grade. But the big thing, and I have to agree with Ed here, because I think we're going to have to look at it as a not completely means test, but perhaps a compromise, which would be like a graduating test. I grew up in a little place in New York City, and they had these Regents tests. And basically the test scores determined, and then they had these scholarships, Lehman scholarships, and did it based on income. In other words, the size of the scholarship was based on the income. So that, let's say a family earned $50,000, the child who qualified, and everyone had to qualify for a scholarship, got X amount. If it were between, let's say, 51,000 and 100,000, they got another amount. So it's not to completely over a certain amount, you don't get anything, but you get
sliding
a lot less. And so the subsidy where it isn't needed isn't given to the kids. They even do that for their graduate scholarships, or the stratified college system. The thing like that, but the point is, I think we're going to have to take a look at it. That was another one. So I was throwing out ideas, but they weren't being received. and I think that's one we're going to have to ultimately get back to, because the vote is going to be there, and the only way to ensure that those who are least able get a larger amount for there, and that would be with Hope as well as with pre-K.
Representative, do you have a response? Representative Councilman.
Since we're having more and more children coming to this state that have language difficulties.
Absolutely.
And I think that's reflected. And if we, everybody wants to raise the quality of education in this state, and everything you read from research is early childhood education, more and more. And I think we've just got to put more emphasis on early childhood education. And I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Just to follow on that, which I was reading in a couple articles this week, and they were talking about how much better kids did if you embed English in language rather than teach them in English language. I mean, in there. So all of your pre-Ks taught in English?
Yes, they are. But we do have many classes that have multilingual teachers. But yes, they are definitely. And we've brought people in to do major training with our teachers too, to make sure they know how to do that properly. Because there's definitely techniques and clean ways of doing that and doing a good job. So we've worked on that. We'll continue to.
Any other? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'll just look at these numbers again, the raw numbers I listed earlier, but I find it, and I know there's a lot of nuances here I don't understand, but it looks like we've spent an average of $4,210 per child going through the pre-K program over the years, and we spent about $4,600 per child for Hope. That just, somebody's got to explain to me how that could work if we're spending that much on a pre-child versus a kid going to a four-year college.
Well,
I need some help on that. So,
yeah. There's a lot of things.
Is that we have in the state of Georgia around 50 to 55% of all of the students lose hope after the first year.
I understand that.
That's right. They didn't come in there with a true beat.
We do have something we say. Every pre-K kid does graduate. That's kind of our in-house. Yes, sir.
They don't have a grade. They don't have a grade criteria they have to go by, huh?
They got to be ready for school. Yes, sir.
Do we hold them back? Do we hold any
We've
pre-Ks
seen
back?
rates of how many
Sometimes.
students never graduate
Yeah.
college. And generally, pre-K, it's a one-year deal. I mean,
Usually, we do give them options though. Sometimes, yeah, they do
I just
graduate.
have
Fail, I
still the,
assume.
the amount of money we're spending per
Yeah.
child there just suddenly doesn't equate in my little mind. So
Any
if you can help
other-
me out sometime on that.
Well, I want to thank you, and if we have, I think we need to continue to discuss this and, decide among ourselves if we want to make any recommendations. If you have any specific recommendations for study committee as well, I welcome that. I think I'll take a couple comments from the audience, but please try to limit them to about 9 seconds, all right?
Madam Chair, my name is Ellen Williams, and I represent both the Georgia Child Care Association and the Early Care and Education Consortium. Just a few brief comments. To your question, we have providers that it's costing about $6,500 to $6,200 a child to educate these children. So I agree with you that when you're talking about, if the $4,200 we spend per child is something that is not a valid number and needs to be looked at by the study commission. We have been working with Chairman Jones, and we really appreciate her efforts to start working on the study commission because the whole funding formula needs to be looked at. Again, to the operations increase, I don't know how many of you all were getting or still paying the rent you were paying in 1994, but our private providers are not. And if the private providers in the audience would just stand up, because they all came today, and I want you to know that they're here and they care and they appreciate the work that you're doing. Many of them are from your districts. So just wanted you to know that they're very interested. To the wait list, first I wanted to say Commissioner Moore has worked with us, went hand in hand to OPB to ask for an increase in the operations budget. I will say what I think she probably can't say. She has to defend the governor's recommendations, and she wanted both and. This wasn't an either-or choice. She really supported us, but the governor wanted to say, let's look at this in a comprehensive package, is what the governor's office has told me, over this next session. I think last session he was a little busy with an election, and he didn't have the time to dedicate to looking at the funding formula. What we would say is do both. Please do something to stop the bleeding now. We talked to Cobb County Schools. The $117,000 was supplements that they were paying to their teachers. They were also estimating an additional $250,000 that they were spending on lights, operations, things to support the program. We private providers are having to do the same thing, and what pre-K is now inadvertently doing is driving up the whole cost of child care across the board, because we are having to cross-subsidize to pay for pre-K what the state is not funding. So what once started out as a adequately funded program, now, as we said, there's that one $8,000 initial gift for grant for supplies. You can imagine 4-year-olds after 12 years can wear out some tables, some chairs, and some supplies. So there's never been anything contemplated to refresh that. And then again, the operations itself has not. And just to illustrate on the teachers as well, the reason we lose teachers in the private sector to the public sector is because those teachers in the public sector get the state health benefit plan, they get the retirement plan, they get the local supplements, which for Cobb County was $117,000 for their 23 classrooms, and they get the T&E, which is state funded. And I have always failed to understand why a certified teacher was not a certified teacher. For some reason, the certified teachers in the public schools deserve this money, and the certified teachers in the private market don't. I mean, either you have the education and the training, or you don't. So that's, again, something for the funding formula that we would ask that you look at. Andy, did you hand out the one thing that we wanted to hand out? We've made a page for each of you that shows you the pre-K centers in your district. The second page you'll see is a fact sheet from us just about what we've been asking in terms of cutting some of the slots. And I would agree it's a policy decision, but I would call it a quantity versus quality decision. Do you want to be providing just quantity so that we can say every kid's in pre-K, or do we want to be giving quality? Because none of these centers can do what they need to do. And if you'll look at the next page, this graph, this shows, the next 2 pages, shows things that are required in 2006 that were not required in 1998 because the commissioner, rightly so, has been saying, this is best practice, this is cutting edge, this is what our centers need to be doing. But we've got that costed out for you, and the second page shows you that these expenses can range from $3,400 to $6,200. So that's, forget cost of living increases. This is additional requirements that we now have to produce to be determined quality. And I also think we need to look at the quality measures. I did want to give you one example, and then I will do waiting list, and then I'll sit down. We had a center who had these maracas, and she's here today. She was told these meet expectations but did not exceed. She was told to buy these for $80 to hit exceeds expectations. So I think we have some issues with our pre-K consultants or in our definition of what is quality, because I don't think anyone would think this should meet expectations and this would exceed. I fail to see the extreme educational difference in these two. Last point on waiting list, and then I'll sit down. The waiting list, the commissioner has again been working hard with us on the waiting list, but here's the problem. A parent can go and sign up at every single one of these providers in here. There is not one uniform sign-up place. So I believe that waiting list is very deceitful. And I will tell you that, and they're working on a formula to try to, they've already taken, as she said, steps to try to rectify it. But I would argue we need one sign-up place per county where a parent lists their preferences so that we can start getting an actual accurate indicator. Because even when they take the wait list, one child, they've been just taking wait lists from the centers. Well, one child may be on 8 different centers' list. So it's a highly inflated wait list. And we have 2 centers here from Paulding and from Rome, who had a problem where additional classrooms were granted across the street or with the school district, and they then had their classes fall to 10 students, well below the classroom. And you have to understand, we are mandated to pay the teachers their salary regardless, but we are reimbursed by the child. So if we lose 10 kids, A, they can take our classroom away because we're under 18, and B, we still have to pay that teacher as if we were getting funding for 20 to 18 kids, but we only had 10 kids. So then we start eating that cost as well. So there's significant problems with the waiting list that really impact our ability to deliver this. I can tell you that the 2 largest chains in Georgia are currently considering getting out of this because it's so becoming such an unprofitable measure. The reason we've been doing it is A, because we care about kids, and B, just like Chairman Jones said, it's sort of like milk at the grocery store. You got to have it even though it costs you to have it because you need that for the other children. I think any parent in here could understand that you're not going to take one child to this center for pre-K and the other 3 to that center for your other child care needs. So with that, I'll shut up and sit down unless you've got any other questions. Thank you for the chance to speak.
I appreciate it, and I've enjoyed working with you, and you've been a great advocate in kind of helping bring some of these issues to the forefront. We're going to keep talking about it this session. With that, I'm going to adjourn the committee. Thank you so much for being here today.
Good job.
You know everything there. Didn't want to know.